you'll have the half the population that support the Democratic Party, seeing this as the operation of the justice system and actually working through the court process. And what there is a narrow band in the middle of voters to play for. What impact this has on them is difficult to tell at this point. And of course, it's not just a thing which is impervious to other factors. How Donald Trump reacts to this conviction will also have an impact on the way in which the electorate look at him over the next 5 months, because he is seething with anger.
Let's also bring in Professor David Dunn, who's a professor in international politics at Birmingham University. Morning, David.
Good morning.
So were you shocked by the verdict? Did you think we might see a hung jury? Or did you think Donald Trump, a Republican leader, the Republican leader, the leader of the MAGA movement, on trial in Democratic New York, it was only going to go one way?
Well, I listened to the trial in great detail, and so I thought the case that the prosecution put was compelling. But of course, that doesn't necessarily result in the verdict that we got. I thought that perhaps while one MAGA Republican would have sneaked onto the jury and would have resulted in a hung jury as a consequence of them ignoring the evidence put before them. And the fact that it took 12 hours suggests that perhaps somebody needed to be convinced and needed to be browbeat by the rest of them. But ultimately, we got where we got. Like your colleague said, I would have put money on it being a hung jury, but actually here we have it. We have convicted on all 34 counts. So it's a stunning result for the case of the 4 legal cases that he faces that was regarded as the weakest case that he had to answer. And to get a full set of results in 34 cases on this one is an indication that actually perhaps even Trump isn't above the law.
And James was just touching on there the fact that convicted felons can still run for president. I mean, historyalmanacs may remember that Eugene Debs, who was the socialist candidate in the early 20th century, actually established the precedent that you could run for president from prison. So Donald Trump, even in the maybe unlikely event that he is imprisoned, will still be on the ballot paper if the Republican Party doesn't choose to replace him at its convention. Why is that? Because in every other country, in many other countries rather, certainly here, you can't be an MP if you're serving a sentence of longer than a year after the people of Fermanagh and South Tyrone elected Bobby Sands, the IRA hunger striker, in the early 80s. Why is it different in America?
It goes back to the gentlemen in Virginia who drafted the Constitution in the 1770s and the 1780s, who had no inkling that any party would embrace a convicted felon or character of dubious morals and ethical practices in the form of Donald Trump. And therefore, they didn't think it necessary to write it into the Constitution because they couldn't imagine what the situation would be now. So that's why it's an omission. And of course, the fact that the Americans venerate their constitution so much means that it's actually very difficult constitutionally to change the constitution. And as a consequence of that, they haven't got a means to prevent him being elected. But I mean, the history has got examples of people who have been in prison and then gone on to be elected by the people. The person who comes to mind, for example, is Adolf Hitler. He spent a year in jail and yet was elected in 1933. So the popular will and a criminal record don't necessarily work in opposition.
And what do you think to James's point, and it's one I agree with incidentally, that this might not necessarily shift the dial, and if anything, it might energise Trump's supporters? Last night, his donations page on his website was crashing, so angered were his followers by what they see as a Democratic conspiracy to undermine him.
I think what we see fundamentally is a further division of the country. And really importantly, that division is made much worse by the reaction of the Republican Party. So what you have is a situation whereby a court, 12 jurors and a legal system deliberated over a 6 weeks period and came to a conclusion. And then one of the major parties of America says that process is illegitimate. So not content with undermining confidence and faith in the electoral system by denying the results of the 2020 election, Now you have a major party embracing the idea that this was a political trial, a conspiracy, that it was rigged, that it was George Soros's money in some way influencing things, and that is deeply problematic for the prospect of bringing the country together. So what you'll have is the Republican MAGA supporters, this tribal cult-like support that he has, doubling down on their belief and the injustice of this. You'll have the half the population that support the Democratic Party seeing this as the operation of the justice system and actually working through the court process. And what there is a narrow band in the middle of voters to play for. What impact this has on them is difficult to tell at this point. And of course, it's not just a thing which is impervious to other factors. How Donald Trump reacts to this conviction will also have an impact on the way in which the electorate look at him over the next 5 months, because he is seething with anger, and that may actually make him even more extreme on the stump.
Well, let me just put two things to you, David, from our listeners. Lisa Wolf texts in saying, something that always surprises me about US politics is how completely the Donald managed to take over the Republican Party and maintain such a stranglehold on them, even after his 4 years of chaos. The complete absence of any group within the GOP who could stand up and challenge him is staggering. And we've seen that, haven't we, from the sort of beauty parade of vice presidential hopefuls willfully and dutifully coming out of the courtroom every day and echoing Trump's lines and even trying to outdo them. I mean, just briefly, why is that, do you think? How and why has the MAGA takeover of the Republican Party been so comprehensive?
It's a really good question, and it really goes back to the processes by which members of Congress are elected. And what happens is that in America, the system is highly gerrymandered, whereby the seats are drawn to have either a Republican majority or a Democratic majority, and therefore the prospect of changing seats is very small, and where the fortunes of Congress are affected by a small number of seats. The majority of seats don't change hands. And because of that, what it means is that the sitting Republicans are not fearful of what Democrats in their seat will vote. They're fearful of what primary challengers from the right will do to unseat them from the right. So what you have is incumbents looking over their shoulders at MAGA possible replacements, and therefore they're trimming to the Republican right to avoid being replaced by more ultra-populist Trumpian figures. And for that reason, they've fallen in behind Trump. And therefore, that explains the capture of the Republican Party by the MAGA base, because those activists are seeking through the primary process to change the nature of representations in Congress. And therefore, you have this supine response of the Republicans in Congress, right the way up to the Speaker, Mike Johnson, who are actually falling in line because they recognize that the base of the party has been captured by those people. And so it's a bottom-up rather than a top-down process. But nevertheless, what it means is a major one of the two major parties in America is now captured by that Trumpian fanaticism.
Well, Professor David Dunn, Professor of International Politics at Birmingham University, thank you so much for that comprehensive and very clear primer on just how Donald Trump's conviction on all 34 of those charges in New York may affect American politics and just why the Republican Party